Very good. Good morning. Let's come to order and please go on the record. I am Commissioner Kimberly W. Duffley, and with me today are Chair Charlotte A. Mitchell and Commissioner Daniel G. Clodfelter. I will now call for hearing docket number EMP-117 sub-0 in the matter of application of Scarborough East Ridge Solar LLC for a certificate of public convenience and necessity to construct a 150 megawatt solar facility in Currituck County, North Carolina. On June 22nd, 2021, Scarborough East Ridge Solar, Scarborough or applicant, filed the application for a certificate of public convenience and necessity with confidential exhibits and confidential pre-filed testimony of Linda Wadaki. On July 7th, 2021, the public staff filed a notice of completeness as required by Commission Rule R8-63D with respect to the completeness of the application, and also filed a motion to stay. On July 14th, 2021, the applicant filed a response to the public staff's notice of completeness and motion to stay. On August 12th, 2021, the Commission issued an order scheduling hearings, filing of testimony, establishing procedural guidelines, and requiring public notice. On August 13th, 2021, the Commission staff sent a letter to the State Clearinghouse requesting comments on the application. On September 15th, 2021, and September 24th, 2021, the Clearinghouse filed its comments. On September 13th, 2021, the applicant filed a motion for extensions of time, which the Commission granted. On October 8th, 2021, the public staff filed a motion to cancel public hearing. On October 12th, 2021, the Commission issued an order canceling public witness hearing. On October 19th, 2021, the public staff filed the testimony of Jay Lucas, utilities engineer in the public staff's electric division, which contained confidential information. On November 4th, 2021, the applicant filed rebuttal or reply testimony and exhibit of Linda Wadaki. On November 16th, 2021, both the public staff and the applicant filed their consent to hold the expert witness hearing by remote means. In compliance with the State Ethics Act, I remind all members of the panel of our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and inquire at this time as to whether any member has a known conflict of interest with respect to the matter coming before us this morning. Please let the record reflect that no conflicts were identified. I will now call for appearances of counsel, beginning with the applicant.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner. My name is Joe Eason. I'm with the Raleigh office of Nelson Mullins, and I'm appearing today on behalf of the applicant.
Good morning, Mr. Eason. Public staff?
Nadia Lohr with the public staff, appearing on behalf of the using and consuming public.
Good morning, Ms. Lohr. Do the parties have any preliminary matters before we begin?
None from the applicant.
None from the public staff.
And do either of the parties plan to address confidential information?
We
The public staff does not.
The applicant does not. We propose to move it into evidence, but not to address it publicly.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Eason, you may call your first witness.
Madam Commissioner, I'd like to call the witness for the applicant, Ms. Linda Wadaki, please. DK plus, pardon me.
Okay, Mrs. Wadaki, do you solemnly and sincerely affirm that the testimony you're about to give this morning will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? You might
Yes,
be on
Commissioner.
mute.
Yes, Commissioner.
Thank you. Mr. Eason?
Ms. Wadaki, would you state your name and your employment position for the record, please?
So my name is Linda Wadiki, and I am the Director of Permitting and Community Relations for Sun Energy One, the parent company of Scarborough East Ridge Solar.
Ms. Wadiki, did you cause to be prepared in connection with the application and the exhibits to the application approximately 13 pages of pre-filed testimony containing 3 exhibits, exhibit 1 being an LCOT calculation, exhibit 2 being the June 2019 feasibility study, for AE-172, and Exhibit 3 being the August 2019 System Impact Study for the same cluster group?
Yes, sir.
If the questions in that testimony were asked to you today, would the, except as supplemented by your reply testimony, would they change in any way?
No.
And did you, in response to the testimony of the public staff, cause to be prepared the 7-page reply testimony, counting the cover and verification, with one exhibit being a 5-page PGM interconnection Q status update?
Yes.
Madam Commissioner, I would move the application and the exhibits thereto, together with the pre-filed direct and reply testimony of the witness, into evidence on support of the applicant's application.
Any objection? Ms. Lohr? Hearing no objection.
Commissioner Duffley, you're on mute.
Any objection, Ms. Lohr?
No objection.
Without objection, the motion is allowed. The application and the direct and reply testimony of Linda Wadicki will be received into the record and treated as if given orally from the stand, and the exhibits will be received into evidence and marked as identified when pre-filed.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner. With that, the witness is available for the cross.
Any cross?
I believe one question for Ms. Mwadike. Good morning. I am looking at page 5 of your reply testimony. And you probably don't need to turn there, but beginning on line 5, you state that you don't believe the decision on the application should remain open pending the revised or any revised DEP affected system study. Isn't it true that a revised affected system study based on PJM's retooling could result in a change in the affected system costs?
That is correct. However, DEP published its affected system study for the AE1Q back in September 9th of this year. So that is 2 months, about two plus months ago. So we do not believe there will be major changes in regards to that with their new affected system study that they might issue later on, which we don't know the date.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions I have.
Okay, thank you. Any reply, Mr. Eason?
I have no questions on the public staff's question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. I said I had no questions on the public staff's question.
Okay, there was a blip in my computer. Commission questions, Chair Mitchell.
I do have a question for Ms. Wadike. So in your testimony, and specifically in your reply testimony, you indicate that it's your position that you all would pay for your fair share, or that Shawboro would pay for its fair share of the affected system costs. Help me understand specifically what you mean by that testimony. What do you mean by fair share? And I'll leave my question there and let you respond.
Yes, Madam Chair. The parent company, Sun Energy One, has been doing solar for over a decade. We have never requested reimbursement for any costs applied to an affected system study by both PJM, Duke, or any of those entities. So right now, we do have 4 projects in the queue ahead of our project. If those projects were to drop out or anything of that nature where we become the first in line, Shawboro, East Ridge, or Sun Energy One, the parent company, will pay for that. If in any way any costs applied to the project, we will pay for our own share That's what we meant with that statement.
And okay, thank you for that explanation. And just one follow-up for you. If the four sort of the four projects or the four interconnection requests ahead of the Shawboro project were to drop out or otherwise be removed from the queue, such that the Shawboro project were assigned all of the affected system costs, is your testimony that, or is it your position that Shawboro would pay for all of those affected system costs?
That's correct, because we are next in line, and for us, we have financial obligations to construct the site. So we will go ahead and pay for it so we can be able to construct the site.
And in keeping with your past practice, you would not ask for reimbursement of those costs?
That is correct, Madam
Okay.
Chair.
All right, thank you. I have nothing further for the witness. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. No questions from Commissioner Clodfelter. So I just have a few questions as well. You stated in your reply comments on page 4 that PJM's retooling of the AE1 cluster is scheduled to be completed between November through January of 2022. Can you just explain a little bit what this retooling process will entail?
Yes, Commissioner. Periodically, PJM will take a look at each queue, like AE1 queue for the Shawboro site to figure out who has dropped or who has lowered the capacity for their project, and they will reassign the costs and things of that nature. So our system impact study, we received it back in August 2029. So we believe there might have been project developers that have dropped out from the queue since then, or decided to lower the capacity for their project. So right now, if they perform the retool between November and January of next year, we should definitely, it gives you more insight in terms of what's going on, and also gives you more insight in regards to costs associated with our projects, if there's any changes.
Okay, thank you. And so is it a matter of cost allocation, or because they are going through each of the queues, you know, going back to AD1 and AD2, will the cost change, like the affected system cost change and the amount of the network upgrades change?
We believe at this time, we're not 100% sure, but we think it shouldn't change that much. It might be a small margin, but we need to get our facility study, which is hopefully due next year, for us to see exactly what costs are allocated to us. But we do not believe that change will be imminent.
Thank you. So you don't believe the change will be significant percentage-wise?
That is correct.
Okay. And you also testified that PJM will provide the updated study results for the Shawboro project, and you just mentioned that in your testimony as well. And do you expect these results by the end of January 2022?
By the end of retooling, we expect by the January 2022. However, the facility study, we believe it might come next year, but PJM haven't given us a definite date for this facility studies. But the retooling, we believe sometime before January, we should see the retooling done on the AE1 queues.
Okay, thank you. And you also mentioned with this retooling that projects ahead of Shawboro may reduce capacity or withdraw from the queue. What is the basis for that statement?
That's kind of what happens in every queue. There are developers, maybe the costs are allocated to them, they cannot proceed with the project. So it kind of varies by decision, a business decision by each developer. So they could, if the cost is so high, they could decide to lower the capacity for their project, or they could decide to just drop out of the queue altogether. So it's based on each business practice or each developer's business practice. So this has happened in the past in other queues, so that's kind of what we believe will happen as well in this scenario.
And you also mentioned that Duke DEP may not have to prepare a new affected systems study. And what's the basis for that statement?
Duke actually performed their affected system study for the PJM AE1Q back in September, I believe it's September 9th, 2021. So that's just a couple of months ago that they performed that. So right now they're retooling or their reanalyzation. We don't know when they will do that. So we do not want to hold on to the project for a year if they're going to do it. We're not sure when they will perform it. So we don't want to just keep the docket open for a year waiting on Duke when they just did one a couple of months ago.
And in general, how quickly is DEP or Duke turning around these affected system studies?
Unfortunately, I cannot state because it varies. It depends on personnel's workload and things of that nature. So I'm not 100% sure how quickly they usually publish it, but it kind of varies. Right now, unfortunately, we do not know when that will come out.
Okay, thank you. And then on page 5, getting to a question Ms. Laura asked you, you stated that supplemental testimony, or she might not have gone this far, supplemental testimony should not be required unless there are major changes to the results of the studies. And what would you consider major changes?
If there's a change in cost that is, let's say $20,000, something of that nature, that is not big enough to make a dire decision on that. If the cost is strong, is way larger than expected, of course, I would want us and also public staff to file. But there are minimum costs associated with it. We have seen changes such as $30,000, which doesn't really break a bank in terms of construction of a solar facility. But anything above like 10 million or things of that nature, of course, we expect to defend that if we do decide to move forward with a project. That's what I meant by that.
Okay, thank you. So that's a big range between 30,000 and 10 million, but I'll.
Yeah, I'll just give you an example. I'm sorry.
But thank you, that was instructive. And then I have one question from staff. In the application, you reference ongoing negotiations to enter into a long-term power purchase agreement for the output of the proposed facility. Has there been any progress in those negotiations?
Yeah, yes, there has been. We have, and this might be a conversation we may have to move into the confidentiality phone call, but we do have an entity that really we have a contract that wants to purchase about over 500 megawatts. And this project in particular is a backup because, as you know, what's going on with Duke affected system upgrade issues going on. We do not know what will happen to other projects. So this particular project is a backup. In addition to that, we have another entity that we are negotiating for this project, but we have not dotted the lines and signed that contract because, again, this one is a backup to one that has already been signed.
And when you say this one is a backup, if the other one goes through, are you saying this project will not move forward?
No, this project will still move forward. We have two PPAs, two different entities. So because we have various projects in the docket right now that have not received their CPCN. So let's say, for instance, one of the project, we are not able to receive the CPCN for one of the projects. This project becomes the backup for that PPA. And let's say all the CPCNs we have in the docket are approved with this particular PPA entity. We have a second entity who will take this project. So that's kind of where we are right now, because we're uncertain on what's going on with a couple of dockets.
Okay, thank you for that. And then on your exhibit 3, and I probably should have asked my own group this, but since I have you on the stand, I'm going to ask you, can you describe a little bit, you talk about the need for the facility, and there's discussion about the annual net energy. Could you tell me what exactly the annual, how do you refer to annual net energy? I looked in the PJM manual and I could not find a PJM definition for it.
Sure, that came from PJM January 2021 forecast for net energy in Dominion territory, and they were projecting a 0.6% per year increase over the next 10 to 15 years, actually. In addition to that, they had the summer peak for Dominion territory as well on a 0.5% increase over 10 to 15 years. So that is just what they anticipate for the next 10 to 15 years increase in energy requirement for their area.
Okay, thank you. So your understanding of that, the definition of that term is the same as Mr. Lucas's?
I believe so.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions. Commissioners, no other questions? Okay, questions on commission questions?
None from the applicant.
The public staff has no additional questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Wadiki.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Okay, Mr. Eason, you finished your case?
That completes our case, Madam Chair. We will rest our applicant's case.
Thank you, Ms.
Well, this
Lord.
is,
Go ahead, Mr. Eason.
we had previously indicated in the reply testimony that we would anticipate submitting the retooling if it's received. So when I say completed that part, we would supplement it if that occurs, or if any developments occur with respect to the output. We will be filing motions on any supplemental events, but we're completed with the case as of today's evidence.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Easton, and we will get to public staff's motion at the end of the hearing. Ms. Lord?
The public staff now calls Jay Lucas to the stand.
Good morning, Mr. Lucas. Do you solemnly and sincerely affirm that the testimony you're about to give this morning will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Lucas, would you please state your name, business address, and position for the record?
My name is Jay Lucas. My business address is 430 North Salisbury Street, Raleigh, North Carolina. I am the manager of operations and planning for the electric section of the energy division of the public staff.
And on October 19, 2021, did you prepare and cause to be filed testimony consisting of 18 pages, an appendix, and 5 exhibits?
Yes.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your testimony, appendix, or exhibits?
No.
And if you were asked the same questions today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Commissioner Duffley, we request that Mr. Lucas's testimony be admitted into evidence as if given orally from the witness stand, and that his exhibits be pre-marked.
Any objection?
No objection.
Without objection, the motion is allowed. You may proceed.
The witness is available for cross-examination.
The applicant has no questions for the witness on his pre-filed. We'll reserve with respect to any questions asked by the commission.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Chair Mitchell?
I have a few for you, Mr. Lucas. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good, thank you.
All right. Do you have your testimony in front of you?
Yes, I do.
Okay, I'll do my best to refer you to pages where I've written that down on my notes. So I'm going to start on page 16, where you page 16, line 11, you reference PJM's retooling of its cluster AE1. What do you mean by retooling?
Projects have dropped out of PJM's queue. It might have been in this cluster or earlier clusters that will affect the projects in cluster AE1. So PJM is having to go back in and reevaluate the system impact statements for those facilities. So we could end up with different interconnection costs and different effects on Duke Energy progress as a result of the retooling.
Thank you for that, Mr. Lucas. How often does retooling and sort of restudy occur for any one cluster in PJM?
We don't know. We just found out about retooling just a few months ago. PJM announced, starting with cluster AD1, it's going to start retooling its clusters based on projects dropping out. This is the first iteration of retooling that I know of.
Is retooling PJM's terminology?
Yes, they call it retooling.
Okay. Okay. And so, Mr. Lucas, to the extent that you know this, at what point does PJM deem a study to be final and actionable? Actionable by the interconnection customer.
I believe once every project has completed its facility study, it deems them to be final.
Okay. Okay. I'm just curious on this one, with respect to this project, my understanding, now you tell me if I'm wrong about this, but my understanding is the projected in-service date of end of 2022. And so if PJM goes in and retools AE1 sometime during 2022, such that the final studies aren't complete until 2023, and this project is actually already in service by then, what happens to this project? Is there any effect on this project from the retooling?
I don't believe PJM will retool after it issues a facility study, and the project can't start construction until after the facility study, and actually a little bit later until it completes an interconnection services agreement.
Okay. All right. Well, that helps me. That sort of puts things in line for me. Okay. And that makes complete sense. All right. All right, Mr. Lucas, you testify in this proceeding as well as in other proceedings before the commission with the public staff regarding the public staff's concerns on the use of the LCOT. And, you know, previously the commission has used the LCOT as a sort of a benchmark for the reasonableness of interconnection upgrade, network upgrade costs associated with any specific project. Help me sort of putting aside for a minute the concerns that you and that you have expressed on behalf of the public staff about the use of the LCOT in general. What is what do you believe is a sort of a range of reasonableness or a reasonable zone for the commission to establish for the LCOT? If the commission were to continue to look at the LCOT as a benchmark for reasonableness, what is a reasonable range?
We have not been able to determine that yet, because there's so many other factors that go into the decision. Total construction costs, other factors that affect the transmission that a utility might be building. At this time, we can't give a range.
Okay. Do you think I'm going to push you a little bit here, Mr. Lucas. Is it the public staff's, or let me just ask you about your opinion. Is it your opinion that it's impossible to establish a reasonableness, a range of reasonableness because of other factors as you've just described?
I think it's difficult. One reason is we receive CPCN applications one at a time, but with these cluster studies, by PGM and also these grouping studies by Duke Energy, these projects are all considered together. It's difficult for the public staff to match up establishing LCOT for one project, knowing that there are other projects that will influence the total transmission construction costs. I believe we have more work to do in that area.
Okay. All right. So, okay. You know, in previous proceedings and previous dockets, the commission has looked at the LCOTs identified by the LBNL study. Do you know which study I'm referencing?
Yes.
The 2019 LBNL study.
Yes.
Do you know, we've compared the LCOT for a particular, you know, application in front of us at the time to the data in that study, and you know, and making, you know, in our consideration on a particular application. Is it your opinion that that's no longer an appropriate thing for the commission to do, and no longer an appropriate analysis for the commission to make?
No, I think it's still valid. One thing I need to point out is the LCOT's a cost benefit ratio. It's the cost of the transmission. It's LCOT's dollars per megawatt hour. So it's a cost of transmission divided by the megawatt hours that that facility will put onto the grid. We've got problems, particularly in these cases in PJM, where Duke Energy Progress's customers are going to be paying the dollars to make the effective system upgrades, but they're not getting the energy. Witness Nwadwiki pointed out that they might have some off-takers, but those off-takers are not in North Carolina. So we'll have citizens in North Carolina paying for transmission, but the energy is going somewhere else. They're not getting the benefit of their transmission dollars. In that scenario, the LCOT does lose some of its meaning if Duke Energy Progress were building transmission for solar facilities that were providing energy to Duke Energy's customers. That would be different. It would be more valid to show that Duke Energy Progress's customers are paying dollars and they're getting a certain amount of megawatt hours through that transmission they're paying for.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lucas. Expound a little bit on a point that you just made about benefits associated with the transmission. I think your testimony is that DEP customers aren't benefiting from the transmission that they're paying for. Did I hear that? Is that your testimony?
Generally it is. Duke Energy Progress's customers could get some benefit, but they're certainly not getting all the megawatt hours from this solar facility. There could be some small system reliability improvement, but no one's quantified that.
Okay. Okay. You testified to this just a moment ago in response to my question about the LCOT and the utility of the LCOT at this point in time, or the validity of the LCOT at this point in time. But you know, I'm hearing you say that the cluster study and the grouping study approach analyze these projects, you know, as a cluster or as a group. So it makes a project by project analysis and recommendation difficult. So what do we do? I mean, how do we consider these projects in the aggregate? What's the best way for us to move forward here on an individual application in light of the fact that projects are being studied now as a group or as a cluster?
I think it's difficult to proceed on reviewing an application. I think we need to do more analysis of the transmission system and what do we really need. What we're receiving are applications that require a transmission upgrade, but we know there are other applications or facilities that haven't even filed an application that also need transmission upgrades. I really can't answer your question. I don't know exactly how to proceed with these individual applications, knowing that they're being studied as clusters, perhaps we need to take a step back and do some analysis of these applications, not just Shawboro, but others.
And when you say analysis, what specifically do you mean? What would you be looking at? Or what should we, the commission, be looking at?
The long-range needs of all transmission that we can reasonably anticipate for these projects. And I need to not talk about Duke Energy. I need to talk what we have in PJM. Unfortunately, we're restricted by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We have lots of projects being built in North Carolina's territory for PJM that aren't providing any energy to North Carolina's customers. As long as these projects do pay their effective system upgrade costs, like Shawboro has agreed to pay them, FERC might not let us do that. As long as they all agree, the public staff's concerns go away.
Let me stop you right there, Mr. Lucas, just so I can understand, make sure I understand correctly. So is it your testimony that if an applicant like a Shawboro voluntarily agrees to accept the costs associated with the upgrades, the public staff's concern about transfer of costs to retail ratepayers in North Carolina goes away?
No, because I wish it would work that way, but we have the American Beach FERC ruling where American Beach and Duke Energy Progress agreed through an effective system operating agreement that American Beach would pay the effective system costs. On October 1st, FERC rejected that and urged Duke Energy to start building the transmission expeditiously. It would be good if that didn't happen. It'd be good if these systems like Shawboro agreed to pay their effective system costs and we could proceed in that manner.
Are you, Mr. Lucas, is it your testimony or is it your opinion that the American Beach ruling casts some doubt on or otherwise creates uncertainty around an applicant's ability to voluntarily assume those costs?
Yes, and I did point a little bit that at my testimony. I'm looking for it.
You did, I reviewed that, so you don't spend time looking for that.
I found it. It's just, and FERC did say based on the specific facts of the case, so it looked like it would not set precedent, but I could see this easily happening in other cases.
Okay. In your testimony, you point out that in the PJM queue right now, there are 7,000 plus megawatts to be, proposed for study and interconnection, and that that sort of dwarfs that roughly 1,800 megawatts that have actually applied for CPCN or for which we have approved a CPCN at this point in time. Help me understand. I need you to provide me with some context about cost implication of the 7,000 megawatts or sort of whatever comes to us from the 7,000 megawatts. What does that look like for, what do you know as a member of the public staff about the potential cost that could be imposed upon DEP retail ratepayers associated with these projects that are currently pending in the PJM interconnection queue?
My fear is that it could be hundreds of millions of dollars of transmission upgrades for effective system transmission upgrades that would have to be paid for by Duke Energy Progress's customers. The clearest example we have is PJM cluster AC1. That's a few hundred megawatts of solar projects, and the effective system costs are $31 million. That's what the American Beach project is in. It's in PJM cluster AC1. So that few hundred megawatts of capacity right now are triggering $31 million of upgrades for Duke Energy Progress. So, and that's cluster AC1. That was opened up in April of 2016. We have several clusters later with thousands of more megawatts coming on. So we are really concerned. This could be a big deal for Duke Energy Progress to pay for.
And is this sort of, are you, the hundreds of millions, is that an informed number or is that kind of a worst case scenario number? I mean, I'm trying to understand how much the public staff knows specifically about costs that are cost implications for DEP network upgrades.
It is a worst case scenario, and we don't know specifically because a lot of the studies that we need are not ready.
Okay.
I'm just using my example of cluster AC1, that one cluster triggering $31 million. So with these later clusters, and I do mention in my testimony, there's one project planned for Terrell County. That one project's 1,200 megawatts. We don't know what the effects are at all on that one.
Okay. Okay. And so, Mr. Lucas, would it be impossible for the public staff to have a better understanding, a more informed understanding of affected system cost implications until DEP actually performs some sort of study?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And, the studies are informed by what's being proposed. So
Yes, yeah. And our concern really, it's just the risk that Duke Energy Progress's customers are carrying. There's so many unknowns and there's so much risk. It's got us very concerned.
Okay. All right. Has the public staff engaged with Duke Energy Progress on this issue? Meaning, let me ask the question differently. Has the public staff had direct conversation with Duke Energy Progress about its concerns associated with the affected system cost implications arising from the PJM interconnection queue?
Yes. And it's been a few months, but we didn't become aware of this problem until May of 2020, and we've had a conversation with Duke Energy. And they've confirmed, yes, we have lots of affected system studies in process, but a lot of them they haven't completed.
And does the public staff have an informed opinion about whether Duke Energy Progress is devoting sufficient resources to studying this issue at this point in time?
I can't give an opinion on that because I don't know how Duke Energy's receiving the information from PJM. We've seen some filings that are critical of the communication between PJM and Duke Energy Progress. One thing that Duke Energy has to face that it can only react to what PJM gives it. So Duke Energy has been cooperative with the public staff. They answer all of our questions, but they can't move faster than what PJM gives to them.
Understood. And thank you for that explanation. Has the public staff engaged with PJM on this issue?
Yes, I've talked some to PJM, and they do provide these system impact statements. But this problem of retooling just arose, and the schedule slid some already. It's slid a couple of months from what they originally projected. Right now, I think witness my DK's right. We're expecting more information in January of 2022 for cluster AD and AE. But PJM is complicated. It is somewhat difficult to understand all of their processes because they, of course, don't operate like a vertically integrated utility. But they are responsive to our questions lately.
And when you say lately, were they previously not responsive in a way that they are now more responsive?
Yeah, I believe so. We had trouble getting information from them. earlier, but that's improved.
Okay. All right, Mr. Lucas, thank you for entertaining my questions and for responding up. That's all from me for now, Commissioner Duffley.
Thank you. Commissioner Clodfelter? Okay, thank you. I have a few follow-up questions and a few questions of my own. Chair Mitchell asked several that I was going to ask, but I did want to follow up on the 7,000 megawatts and this triggering hundreds of millions of dollars in affected system costs. So I think I heard you say that you don't really have hard data, that you were using the AC1 cluster maybe as a kind of benchmark to come up with the hundreds of millions of dollars. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Thank you. And do you know or have any idea of the percentage or the number of megawatts out of that 7,000 that will most likely be built?
No, and that's part of put in my testimony. Just in the past 5 years, 3,600 megawatts of solar has dropped out of PJM's queue, and that's just in North Carolina. So it is very difficult to pin down, and I see why PJM has to retool. Lots of big projects drop out. All the transmission has to be restudied because the way PJM evaluates these projects is they depend on earlier queued projects completing their upgrades to study later projects. And if those earlier projects drop out and those upgrades aren't there for the later projects, it requires a restudy.
Well, and is there a way for the commission to find out this information regarding the speculative projects, or is that what the retooling will provide?
It's possible to delve deeper into PJM's analysis. The problem is there are just so many projects in various stages of interconnection. There are a lot of pieces and there are a lot of steps as they move along. Perhaps we could work more closely with PJM and understand what projects are dropping out, when they're most likely to drop out, and understand better what the capacity of those projects are and how they're affecting the grid.
Thank you. And I just kind of want to get a handle of the load in this area where the projects are being built. Do you know what the current peak load or the load profile looks like for DENC?
I don't know. We knew a few years ago, I think average load was around 500 megawatts. We could ask about peak load and get that information out. One thing that concerns us is these solar facilities, of course, run during the daytime. And if we have weekends where there's low load, all of the solar capacity will generate far more energy than what Dominion Energy North Carolina needs. That energy will, of course, head northward into PJM.
Thank you. You also mentioned that an affected system could build upgrades that could go unused for extended periods of time because the projects may withdraw. And so my question that I'm trying to get a handle on is, for example, when you're discussing the value of storage, there's a benefit in the deferral of a transmission asset, and there's a dollar value assigned to it with that deferral of the assets. And in your example, you're stating there may be some extended lumpiness in the build and of the affected system, and that it might be built too early. And I don't think that you're saying that it would never be needed, but correct me if I'm wrong, but that it's being built potentially too early. And so in the ANOPR comments, some are stating that it might be a good idea to proactively build transmission, and that might be a more efficient way to build out the transmission system during this energy transition. And so what I'm trying to get a handle on is, how do these dollars compare? The proactive build dollars and the benefits for this proactive build versus the dollars that are assigned to transmission deferral. So I mean, has anyone ever compared those dollar amounts, or am I off the chart? Meaning, am I comparing apples and oranges?
No, that's a good comparison. Of course, this transmission has to be built before these generators can be turned on and activated. One of our concerns is who pays for that transmission up front, and who carries the cost, and who's receiving the benefit. And all this doesn't seem fair, because within DENC, in PJM, these solar developers have to pay for all their upgrade costs that it takes to move their energy. But just a short distance away in Duke Energy, FERC requires Duke Energy's customers to pay for it. They don't require these developers to pay for their transmission, just because they happen to be living nearby. But to your point, I believe it would be wise to start planning for this large level of transmission and figure out a fair funding mechanism to get the transmission built ahead of the generation.
Okay, thank you for that. You also talked about how the money spent could be wasted because another upgrade could come along, so that it doesn't fulfill, the upgrade doesn't last its full useful service life. So could you just describe a little bit more? What do you mean by wasted?
Okay, that's a good question. For example, in this case, Shawboro will affect transmission line. It's called the Everett-Greenville line. Shawboro is 150 megawatts. But we've got a system impact study for a 1,200 megawatt system, something that's 8 times larger than Shawboro in Terrell County. If Duke Energy has to make effective system upgrades to allow for Shawboro or an earlier queued project that would allow Shawboro to interconnect, Duke Energy could go back in and have to replace the wire it had just put in. If the wire size to accommodate Shawboro and some earlier queued projects is not sufficient to allow this very large project in Terrell County, Duke Energy would have no choice but to take down the wire after a few years and replace it with larger wire. In our conversation with Duke Energy, another thing, we have some other smaller transmission that's affected by some of these projects. The Rocky Mount Battleboro line, that's only 115,000 volts. What happens up to a point, a certain transmission voltage can't handle but a certain size wire. So not only you're going to have to put larger wire on a transmission system, you'd have to take or replace it with something of larger voltage, build a whole new transmission line at a higher voltage to accommodate the solar. But sort of going back to the Everett-Greenville problem, these transmission wires are supposed to last many years, 40 years, 50 years. And there's a lot of installation cost to install them and take them down. So we're just concerned about all this money being wasted within a few years.
Okay, thanks. So that's good information. So when you're talking about an incremental upgrade, say on a 230 kV line, you're saying that you're not just adding an additional increment on top of what has just been built. They physically, even with the increments on the same voltage, you have to take one wire down and put a new wire, replace it.
Yeah, at the same voltage, but there's a limit to the size of wire that one voltage can handle.
Okay. And how many times typically can a line be upgraded before you have to go to a next step up?
I'm not sure the number. Each voltage has a certain number of wire sizes that it can handle. There's a few different wire sizes for each voltage. I don't have that information, but I can get it.
Okay, thank you. And why is it more appropriate to calculate the LCOT using a facility's average capacity factor versus its first year capacity factor? And how much do capacity factors degrade for solar facilities over time?
The LCOT uses the total energy that a facility will generate over time. In some of these projects, it's about a 40-year service life. We've seen degradation usually about 0.5% per year. So what's happening is the facility is putting out less and less energy, a little bit less and less every year. And that is reducing the capacity factor. I've testified here. I've disagreed somewhat with a witness which IK used. My calculation wasn't different by much. I think my LCOT was maybe 10% higher than hers, but I think it is more appropriate. The capacity factor of a solar facility is going to go down every year a little bit, so I think it's more appropriate to use or to consider the output of the facility in the later years to calculate the LCOT, because LCOT is a long-range projection of a facility's effectiveness or cost effectiveness.
Okay, thank you. And we heard Mrs. Wadicki state that with this retooling that she didn't see any type of change or drastic change in the potential affected system upgrades in the present case. Do you agree with that testimony, or what is your opinion?
I can't agree to that yet because I really have no idea as to what the retooling is going to cause. I don't know what has dropped out that's going to trigger this retooling.
And with this retooling, I saw that the AD1 cluster was part of this retooling as well. I know that this is not part of the case, so you may not have the answer, but in the AD1 cluster, there were not affected system costs for some of those projects. With this retooling, could those projects be assigned affected system costs for AD1 cluster?
Yes, Shawboro is dependent on some improvements to be done in the AD1 cluster. If some of those projects drop out, it could push more costs onto Shawboro. One thing
but my question is, if a project originally did not, in the AD1 cluster, did not have affected system costs, could this retooling change that result?
Yes, if that project was dependent on some earlier improvements.
Okay, thank you. And so I believe I heard the applicant agree to wait until PJM releases its retooling. And my question to you is, what's the purpose served by waiting for the affected system results from DEP?
Yes, the retooling will indicate some lines that DEP might need to improve. But I believe we should wait until DEP completes its affected system study, because we won't know the costs that DEP is going to have to pay until they complete that affected system study.
But and I guess where I'm headed, and you spoke with Chair Mitchell about this with respect to the cumulative impacts to DEP's customers. Where is the tipping point? At some point, do you, in your opinion, do you think that the public staff will come to the point that they recommend a denial of the grant of a CPCN?
Oh yes, that could easily happen if Duke Energy progresses. Customers are paying for transmission that does not benefit them at all. We would definitely recommend denial.
Okay, do you have any idea at this point where that tipping point might be?
Do you mean in dollar costs?
However you would make that decision.
I could put a dollar on it, but if we determine that the cost to DEP's customers were de minimis, almost no effect on their bills, public staff could recommend acceptance of the CPCN.
Okay, and so what would that affect on the bills? Like what percentage of bill increase do you think could potentially change public staffs or
Yep.
lead
If we-
public staff to seek a denial of a CPCN? If you know, if you don't know today.
I can provide some answer to that. We can't calculate it down to a percentage increase in a customer's bill because of the number of projects coming in. If it was just a small fraction of 1% for one CPCN, on face value, it might look good, but we have to understand there are hundreds of projects in the queue for Dominion and for Duke Energy. So this accumulative effect can grow to be large. One example is the Frisian case in EMP-105. That system required somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 million in upgrades to that one project. And that was significant enough to calculate a percentage effect on customers' bills. But it was easy to assess that because it was one project. Public staff is concerned about the cumulative effect of these hundreds of projects coming along and the total cumulative effect on these customers' bills.
Okay, thank you. And you were talking with Chair Mitchell about that DEP's customers might be able to receive a small reliability benefits potentially. Are those small reliability benefits quantifiable?
Perhaps they are, but I don't believe anyone's done any reasonable work on it to say if Duke Energy Progress customers pay for these upgrades, even though they're not getting the energy, there's some quantifiable benefit. I don't think anyone's done anything reasonable on that.
Okay, thank you for that. Those are all of my questions. I'll follow up with the commissioners to see if they have any follow-up questions. No? Okay, questions on commission questions?
I just have one quick question for Mr. Lucas.
Okay, and Mr. Eason, you were on mute. Do you have questions?
Yes, I do. I apologize. I am on mute. But I do have some questions on the questions.
Okay.
If public staff wanted to go first, or would I go first?
Yep, you go ahead.
All right. Mr. Lucas, I wanted to just ask a few questions. A couple of times in your testimony, you alluded to the fact that the 40-year useful life and the fact that it is a conceivable possibility that if upgrade costs were made for a specific project, that subsequent projects might require upgrades shorter than that 40-year period. Am I understanding that's one of the concerns you have when you use the term waste?
Well, there are two ways I've talked about that. One of them is the fact that some transmission might be built too soon to accommodate solar facilities that later get canceled. Another way I talk about waste is construction of transmission assets that are inadequate to serve a later queued project, even just a few years later, and those transmission assets would have to be removed and increased to accommodate a later project.
So in the second instance, the construction queues to accommodate a later project, isn't that something that could happen with regard to an incumbent-owned facility as well?
It could happen, but these projects are coming in such short order. We used to build generating plants that were many years apart in construction, but now with this large increase of facilities in PJM's North Carolina queue, they're just a few years apart. And I guess another point is when incumbent utilities build transmission assets, it's to serve that utilities customers.
Good. Well, that's what I was going to mention. You've referenced the examples that one of the concerns you had with ELCOTs were that there is no benefit of the energy to the ratepayers of DEP that may have a share. Isn't that true with respect to any third-party owned generation that's not being sold to a North Carolina entity?
That could be if a third-party generator is built somewhere in North Carolina, and it sends that energy to another state. It's possible that North Carolina customers could be paying for transmission that's not serving them.
Well, in regards to that, is there any benefit to the North Carolina ratepayers of Duke Energy Progress to having a competitive wholesale transmission market or a competitive wholesale power market adjacent to it?
That's beyond what's under consideration in this case. That's a much larger question.
But is that capable of calculation? What the benefit the North Carolina ratepayers in the Progress area have been enjoyed as a result of the federal competition policies?
Objection. I think we're going beyond the scope of the application at hand in this case.
Madam Chair, I think that's precisely the point. They are concerned about a asset, a generation resource that's directed toward a federal market that's competitive, and the problems it's causing for a market where it's a is a vertically owned integrated transmission owner. I mean, that seems to be the problem that the Atlantic Beach is raising. I think it's all over the testimony in this docket.
Well, I think I heard Mr. Lucas say that he wasn't prepared to testify, but I'll allow him to testify to what he can testify to.
I'm not really prepared to testify about competitive markets at this time.
Well, the reason I'm asking, does the public staff attribute any value to the North Carolina intrastate ratepayers of having a wholesale competitive market or a competitive market where there's competition in the ownership of transmission assets?
I don't know. For one thing, the commission doesn't really regulate the wholesale markets.
Well, I understand that. This commission doesn't.
Yes.
Well, the point that you're making that there's no benefit to the energy isn't it basically an indirect assertion that the public staff disagrees with having a competitive a difference in policy for vertically owned transmission and independently owned transmission?
Well, that's not really the public staff's point. My point is it's the cost causation principle. Whoever causes the cost for that transmission should pay for it. Whether it's a competitive market or not.
Well, you mentioned that the developers of a solar project inside the PJM footprint inside the state of Virginia would have to pay for all the upgrades without reimbursement. Is that correct?
No, that's not quite what I said. Any generator developer in PJM has to pay the full costs to interconnect that system into PJM. But if they're close to North Carolina or having effects on Duke Energy has to start paying for some of those upgrades, and we don't think that's fair.
Now, you mentioned the Duke's pace on the preparation of affected system studies. What is the public staff's understanding of how many affected system studies Duke conducts in a quarter? Objective criteria, measurements, and how many months they take. Has the public staff collected that data from Duke?
No, we don't have that data. I filed testimony in a different case several months ago. I think at one time Duke Energy had 22 affected system studies in progress underway.
And those have to be done by interconnection or by cluster group?
Those are done by cluster group. PJM will inform Duke Energy of the projects that could affect Duke in each cluster. Like I brought up the example, AC1, I believe there are 5 projects that are being developed in cluster AC1 that could affect Duke Energy. So PJM told Duke Energy, here are the 5, here are their capacities, the locations, and other data, and Duke Energy developed an affected system study.
And you indicate they have approximately 20 to 22 going, but is there no publicly available indication of how rapidly, how many are conducted, what expectations potential interconnection customers should have with regard to the pace at which these will be done?
Well, when I said 22 underway, that I did testify to that. I put that in testimony several months ago. I can't remember the docket, but it's possible to investigate the pace, inquire at Duke Energy, ask them, when are you getting system impact studies and what type of information are you getting from PJM? And once all that information is complete, how long is Duke Energy taking to develop an affected system study?
But the public staff doesn't have that data presently.
No, we don't.
Okay. Now, you indicated that it's difficult sometimes to understand PJM because they don't operate as a vertically integrated entity. And,
Yes.
and you were talking with regard to the studies. What is your understanding about how the PJM process is different vis-a-vis the independent developers, such as the applicant here, as compared to Duke, a vertically integrated operator of transmission?
What PJM does is twice a year, they open up a cluster. This Shawboro is in cluster AE1, and that's open for 6 months. It's open for a few months, and every project in PJM enters that cluster. That project could be in Illinois, but they all gather them in that cluster, and PJM studies them as one group. And there are large effects. I mean, there are thousands of megawatts in each cluster, and PJM starts doing the interconnection analysis. But it comes to a point where, for some of the projects, it realizes that it will have affected systems. It could be TVA or someone else, but they do identify what could affect Duke Energy and informs Duke Energy, say, hey, we've got some projects that could affect you. Here they are, here are their capacities, here's the data. And Duke Energy takes that data and develops an affected system study. And that's different from Duke Energy. I know I'm going a little long-winded, but Duke Energy operates differently. We're just in the process of going from serial consideration, where each project's evaluated one at a time, to a cluster study project, cluster study project process in Duke that doesn't operate the same way. It'll gather projects in a closer vicinity. For one thing, Duke Energy's footprint in the Carolinas is a lot smaller than PJM, but it's right now developing a transition cluster to move projects from a serial study to a more cluster study process. So we're in transition in Duke Energy. What PJM has been doing has been going on for many years.
And Mr. Easton, I remind you, these questions are questions on commission questions.
Yes, ma'am. I'll be very quick. One last thought on that is, you mentioned the cost allocation and the interplay with the cluster group process. In the PJM process, is cost responsibility assigned to the first unit seriatim?
I know Duke Energy requires that in affected system studies. I believe so, yeah. The first project to trigger those upgrades has to pay the full cost of those upgrades, even if some later project can use some of that capacity to interconnect. Yeah, so the first project to trigger upgrades does have to pay.
Now, you're referring to the PJM or Duke?
I'm referring to Duke.
That's in the PJM system. Is it the same process? Is it all cost responsibility assigned to a single developer and a single development project?
I'm not sure about that.
Well, if and subject to check, it was found that they aggregate those costs or divide those costs among the group in some form of proration. Do you have a perception as whether assigning 100% of the costs to a single developer versus prorating among a group or members of a group would have more or less effect on this dropping out process? You've made a significant point of the fact that a number of projects in the North Carolina area of PGM drop out. Is there any concern on the part of the public staff that perhaps the assignment of 100% of the cost to one developer when there are 5 developers potentially going to use a line has the consequence of causing the dropout, because it might affect the financial viability of each one if 100% has to be absorbed by that developer?
Sorry, objection. I think we're going beyond commission questions here.
Response, Mr. Eason.
I believe he's indicated that one of the concerns that the public staff has is associated with cost causation, and my point is only to emphasize that that's a Duke decision, because it's not necessary to utilize the cost allocation principle that Duke chooses. And I believe the witness can confirm PJM does a different method for assigning costs, not to the first user, 100% to the first user.
Okay, I'm going to allow this question, but Mr. Eason, please keep in mind these are questions on commission questions.
That's my final question, Madam Chairman. Go ahead, Mr. Lucas.
If PGM were to assign these significant transmission costs to the first project, yeah, that could cause a project to lose financial viability. If it were more organized, where different projects pay a fair share of the upgrades, it could lead to them dropping out. But we're straying away from the mission of the public staff, and we're here to protect the using consuming public. It's difficult for the public staff to get too far involved in some of these projects dropping in or remaining in the queue, start to stray from the mission, our mission of protecting the using and consuming public.
I have no more questions, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Lohr.
Just one quick question. Mr. Lucas, Chair Mitchell asked you about the validity of continuing to use the LCOT as a consideration when reviewing CPCN applications. And just to be sure we clarify, do you believe that the LCOT should be a factor when looking at CPCN applications?
Yeah, it should be one of the factors, yes.
And that's all that I have.
Okay, thank you. It looks like, thank you, Mr. Lucas. It looks like we've come to the end of the day. I want to thank both the witnesses for testifying today. In dealing with proposed orders, we need to work through the public staff's motion to hold the record open until PJM's retooling, as well as DEP developing a revised affected system study. As I understand it, the applicant consents to hold the record open until PJM releases the retooling of cluster AE1, but does not consent to hold the record open until Duke has time to review and determine any revisions to the affected system study. Would either party like to be heard on this motion?
Your Honor, we would like to be heard, only to say that our position is that, to put a little bit more point on, is that it's premature to make the determination that one must wait until the DEP study is conducted, because we need to get some sense of what the retooling, the magnitude and quantification is before any party should be assuming that it's necessary or not, or advocating that it's unnecessary. Again, it's the position of the applicant is, we believe, because the facility study was September, only 2 months away, that the retooling is not going to have a material or substantial impact, and that it won't be necessary to see the cost numbers in light of what will come from the retooling. But we believe it should be we should all wait and see that before we make any determination.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Lohr.
Thank you, Commissioner Duffley. The public staff maintains its position as stated in the testimony of witness Lucas, we think it'd be prudent to wait to see PJM's retooling and then to see if DEP is going to move forward with a revised affected system study, and if so, to actually see the results of that study.
Okay, I have lost, okay, you're back. Okay, I don't know what's going on with my internet today. Thank you, Ms. Lohr. The commission will hold the record open until PJM releases its retooling of cluster AE1. The parties, I believe the applicant stated that they would file the retooling with the commission, and at that time, the commission will determine next steps.
That's satisfactory, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. And are there any other matters before we adjourn for the day?
Yes, I believe that the public staff needs to move the exhibits of Mr. Lucas into the record and have them marked as pre-marked.
Okay, any objection?
No objection.
So
You-
moved.
Madam Chair, I want to confirm, I believe I moved all the application and all exhibits, including, and the testimony and all exhibits into evidence, but and as I recall, you allowed that, but just to be sure for the record, I renew that motion.
Okay, any objection? So moved. You both did, but we've done it again, so we're clear. Thank you, everyone. Anything else before we adjourn for the day? We're so adjourned. Everyone have a good afternoon.
Have a good Thanksgiving.
Let's go off the record.
Thank you.